everyone. Welcome back to Crosstabs. I'm your host, Farrah Bostic. We're back from about a month's break. We needed to regroup, plan new episodes, develop some additional stories I think you're really going to like. More on that in weeks to come. But today, I have a guest who has been on my list of people to talk to since I started the show. I followed her work for a long while now, actually, and followed her on social media, where she posts frequently and delightfully. Seriously, today's guest is a great follow. And eventually, I was able to connect with her and bring her onto the show to talk about her expertise as a journalist and a pollster. She is Ariel Edwards-Levy, editor of polling and election analytics at CNN, where she covers the intersection of politics and public opinion. Before joining CNN, Ariel was a senior reporter and polling editor at HuffPost. She is a member of the American Association for Public Opinion Research and the winner of the 2019 APSA Carey McWilliams Award for major journalistic contributions to the understanding of politics. She joined me to talk about communicating polling to people who aren't pollsters, how she approaches the design of questions to account for framing, information asymmetries, and the gulf that exists in people's mental models between the abstraction of an issue and the concrete experience of it. And we talked about polling outside of election cycles and the way that polling is really a form of reporting. It's a great conversation. I hope she'll come back so we can talk some more. And I'm really excited to bring the conversation we just had the other day to you right now. So, Ariel, thank you so much for being willing to chat with me about your work. I think a great place for us to kind of ground these conversations is often just in how you got to where you are today, what your background is, and how you developed your career and expertise.
Thank you so much for having me. Like, I think a lot of people in this industry, I ended up here completely by accident. My background is in journalism. I was a journalism poli-sci major in college, which is a very classic combination.
Same.
Yeah. Like I said. So in my first year working professionally was 2012. I was interning during the presidential campaign. And at the end of my internship, they said, okay, we have the job that's open here. This was at HuffPost, was covering polling and doing polling aggregation for pollster.com, RIP. And I knew absolutely nothing about polling. So I thought, okay, I'll learn something new. This is obviously something that comes up. Maybe I'll do this for a year or two and then, go back into doing other things. And it has been a lot longer than a year or two since that, obviously. And I absolutely love it. And I think what I love about polling, coming from a journalistic perspective, is that it really is still about talking to people. And it's an entire beat of journalism that's just completely predicated on the idea that what the American public thinks and what people think is fundamentally really important. How ordinary people think about politics, what's important to them, what their belief structures are, what they value, and finding ways to ask questions that really shed new sort of light on that. And then also doing it at scale so that you're not just talking to the loudest voices or whoever you happen to run into when you're reporting out a story on, a Wednesday afternoon, but just this cross section of people who maybe don't get to have their opinion shared in politics quite as often.
Yeah, last year when I spoke with Aaron Zitner at the Wall Street Journal, he had a similar kind of love of this type of reporting. And one of the other things he remarked upon was also the ability to kind of see those values and beliefs and attitudes evolve over time. And I'm curious about, how you approach that. Have you noticed big shifts? Is that something you're keeping an eye on as you continue to talk to the public in this way?
Yeah, I think the longitudinal aspect of it is absolutely fascinating because there's always this tendency to assume that politics is completely static and that views are completely sort of ossified along partisan lines. And they typically are until they aren't. And sort of one of my rules for looking at politics is that people get very obsessed with trying to figure out, like, is this changing? Is this not changing? And I think when there really is a big shift in public perception, sort of definitionally, you'll notice because you can look at a chart and just see, okay, this is when things started changing. If you look, for instance, at public opinion on same-sex marriage, you can see that really huge shift over the past decade or so. You also see, I think, thermostatic public responding is a topic that's gotten a lot of interest when political eras sort of start and end, which is people sort of reacting in a backlash against whatever's currently happening. I think you've seen a lot of that. I think during the first Trump era, you saw a lot of liberalization on issues where he was conservative, on things like immigration. I think, during the Biden era, during the sort of COVID and obviously right before the Biden era, sort of shifting into the Black Lives Matters movement, which really had a real impact on public opinion. And then you did see some sort of backlash to that. And I think right now we're sort of seeing that again. We had some recent polling where we found that views of how big you wanted the government to be, we asked a question, do you think the government should be doing more to solve problems, or do you think that it's doing too much and it should leave things alone? And the percent saying it should be doing more to solve problems was really, really high. And that's, I think, a combination of two different things. One is that sort of backlash, that sort of, this is not what we want. The other, I think, is in the Trump era, Republicans rethinking how attached they are to the idea of small government. And so you really see these sort of forces shaping. Sometimes it's just society changing its mind. After Roe, I think, is another huge example. The way that people thought about abortion shifted. And that's something that has been pretty hugely stable. But you did see this notable change in the aftermath of this big political decision that really upended the policy impact for a lot of people. And things like that, you see sort of political elites, sometimes leading the charge, sometimes having to respond to where the public is on an issue, but it doesn't stay the same. There are a lot of things that are very stable, but there are real changes that I've seen over my time working in this. And that's what keeps it fascinating, because it isn't just measuring something that never changes.
So I think that's a really interesting place to talk about some of these kind of these shifts, and some of it seems to operate in a way kind of like going from the theoretical to the real, right? Like some of the thermostatic thing is like, well, whoever's in charge gets blamed for whatever I don't like, and so I'll swing to the other direction. I think that's a kind of colloquial understanding of the thermostatic response in American politics. But the other part of it, as you bring up with both the fallout from Dobbs and this sort of I wish government did more moment that you have in this most recent poll that we'll make sure that we have a link to in the show notes here, is really particularly interesting, because my intuition about it, at least, is that when it goes from the theoretical to the real, like abortion makes me uncomfortable, I kind of wish it would go away, so I'll communicate that disfavor about the topic to pollsters until it starts to have concrete results for people that I didn't really have in mind when I was thinking about that policy, or have, I didn't really think you would take it away kind of stuff as well, I think, happening there. That changes the perception of the whole kind of frame around the issue. I think in the same way that people kind of theoretically want government to be more efficient and to have less waste and all of those sorts of things, there is still like essential stuff the government does that we maybe didn't spend a lot of time thinking about. And we didn't mean that. Like, no one wanted to get rid of the weather service or whatever. And so those things are very interesting in the sense of like when things go from abstract to concrete, maybe in people's lives. And I wonder how you think about like question design to kind of get, how much time do you spend trying to figure out how to ground a question so that it feels more material to people?
I spend a whole lot of time thinking about that. One of the sort of points, I think you raised such a great point about how people think about this and how that changes, is that I think it's a really good reason to be very cautious about forward-looking questions that ask people to how they might hypothetically feel about something if it happens, because I think that is so hard for people to answer. And often those responses get really tempered by reality. So there's always this sort of obsession where we know something could happen. People want to sort of predict and forecast and want to ask these questions like, okay, so if somebody did this, would this make you more likely to support them or less likely to support them? And I kind of hate questions like that, because I think it's very frequently not completely tethered to what's going to happen. And I think it's hard to use those as predictive valves when I think people themselves don't necessarily know how they're going to feel about things. When it comes to writing these questions, I think the challenge is, I'm not sure there's like one level of truth where it's, if you reach this particular level of specificity, it represents the right answer that really tells you what people think. If you give people a full day where you say, okay, we're going to sit you down, we're going to connect you with the experts, we're going to give you every single detail about this policy so you understand it inside and out, and then we're going to ask you what you think. On one sense, people are going to be the best prepared possible to answer that question because they have this incredible understanding of it that they know the ins and outs, they can make a really reasoned decision. On the other hand, if what you want to know is how are people out in the country feeling about this right now, almost nobody is going to be interacting with the issue in that way. You're creating this sort of treatment that doesn't really exist in the real world. And if you want to know sort of what the prevailing sentiment is, maybe the better gauge is where are they coming into it without being given all this information. And I don't think there's usually one correct answer. I think a lot of the times the best thing you can do is ask at a couple of different levels. How do people think? Do people think this issue is being handled well? If you're just sort of asking them that out of the blue. Okay, so which aspects of that issue are people happy with, not happy with? Do people, when you give them more details, is this something they are aware of? Is this something and if you look at this and if, someone is happy about an issue overall, you give them more details about this and suddenly their view changes, you get sort of a sense of what those pivot points are, what the things are that are really sort of operative in whether people feel good about this or not. I think CBS very recently just put something out on immigration that I thought was a really smart question where they asked, do you agree with President Trump's sort of vision on immigration and then the way he's handling it? And the views on handling were much more negative. And that shows you sort of here's where one of those disconnects are. So I think it's really sort of the best you can do often is sort of ask a bunch of questions and sort of see where things start changing, because I think each of these questions tell you something and nothing tells you everything.
Right. I mean, I think that's also a really interesting point about sort of mismatched expectations about what, people who are commentators on politics, people who write about politics for a living, people who work in polling, who work for campaigns, their level of awareness about any particular issue or candidate is very different than the average person's. And, there's clearly a lot. You just have to scroll through Blue Sky to see people's frustrations with, what were people voting for when they voted for candidate A or B. And if you were watching them very closely and listened to every speech they gave and read every position paper they put out during the campaign, and you don't know why these people didn't know about it, well, because they weren't doing what you were doing, right? But I think that creates a real kind of interpretive challenge for people who are not pollsters looking at these results going, well, what do you mean you want government to do more when we also ask you questions about, is the government wasteful and are we spending too much on all of these things? And you say yes to all of those things. And so there's kind of this gap in understanding about the issues from the perspective of the person asking the question, the person who wants the answer to the question, and then the people who are actually providing the answers to the question. I wonder if you can talk about how you kind of try to thread the needle of everyone not having the same context. Do you try to make the question more general? Talk about those sort of layers that you were just describing, because I think that's a really interesting approach to trying to figure out just how much people know and then using that to kind of interpret their responses.
Absolutely. And I think, the first thing I would say is that it really calls for humility on a lot of axes. One thing that I think is a really easy trap to fall into from that sort of complication that exists is to say, oh, well, obviously these people just don't really pay enough attention. They don't know. If they paid more attention, if they read the right information, then they would agree with me. And sometimes that's true. And I think a lot of times there's a limit to how much that's true. And I think a lot of times the sort of underlying attitudes about whether people are paying attention to things, how people are sort of following things, sometimes tracks with their underlying political opinion. So I don't want to frame it like, oh, well, the only difference is if people read this more closely, they would change their minds about things. Because I think that's sometimes the case and very frequently not the case. In terms of analysis, I think it's just really understanding what is this question? What exactly are people asked? I try to be, when I'm writing about polling, extremely conscious about reflecting the question language, because framing is not the only thing. People have underlying views. to go back to the Dobbs example, because this is one of my favorite things, people go, oh, it's only framing, you can get people to say anything. After Dobbs, the share of people who say that Roe should not have been overturned has been extremely stable, and that's almost regardless of how you ask. If you ask about entitlement programs, it is really hard to get people to say that they don't like Social Security. Like, there are things that people believe that no matter how you ask, you are not going to get them to not think their underlying beliefs. But especially in questions where there is a lot of ambiguity, questions where there's a lot of, they're very complicated, that people don't pay as much attention to, that people have conflicted opinions about, it really does matter what specifically are you asking people to respond to. And I try to be very clear about engaging audiences with, this is what we asked people, and this is what they were given as responses, and this is how they divided up. Something as simple as whether people were allowed to say they don't know is something I'm kind of obsessed with in surveys, because I think that's a huge effect on how people end up responding. And it's not necessarily that one is valid or not, whether how people fall when they're sort of pushed to give an answer that they might not have tells you something, but whether they want to give you an answer also tells you something.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's just sort of acknowledging that complexity, acknowledging that people have really complicated, sometimes conflicting opinions. People think about things more than other things. People have their own guiding principles that are very different, and just everybody has their own unique lens on politics and sort of guiding principles that are important to them versus things that they'll be willing to sort of say, oh, hey, yeah, I guess I think that, but isn't necessarily quite as core to them. And just, I think having some level of humility and some level of nuance and caution when we're talking about how fixed any of this is and what we can sort of glean as like a huge broad takeaway versus, well, we know now more than we did before we asked this question, and it will keep us from making assumptions about what people might say if they were given this question.
Right. This also leads me to think there's a lot of value, obviously, in being able to ask the same or similar questions over periods of time. Not all questions need to be asked every time you go out in the field. Some can be asked sort of periodically. But that might give you that kind of early detection that tides are turning or that things remain stable. But I think the other thing that's interesting about it is this kind of attentional question of how, Social Security has been around a really long time now. Everybody has a relative who's used it, right? Just about. And so there is a kind of familiarity with that. Abortion has been a salient topic in electoral politics since Roe v. Wade and before. But so people kind of have at least an idea about how they feel about it. But when there's a kind of new issue or an emerging, here I might be thinking about things like AI policy or, what do we do about cryptocurrencies or those kinds of things where people don't even necessarily fully have their arms around what that is. And you try to ask them about these kind of new political movements, new technologies, new topics and trends. I wonder how you think about introducing a topic you've never asked about before. How do you approach designing questions when you don't have any historical data to base it on?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. And I always do think it's really interesting to look at these questions because one thing is that it's where partisan opinion often hasn't quite as settled or formed as strongly because and I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing, but people use often partisanship as a heuristic. And especially if you're someone who does have strong partisan views, a lot of times you'll think, okay, well, if my party feels very strongly about this issue, feels very strongly about this person, it gives you sort of a framework, even if you haven't been paying a huge amount of attention to sort of latch onto and figure out where your views might end up aligning. When you're asking about something new, I think one of the first things that's always interesting to me is attention questions. And with AI specifically, it's sort of the bane of my life in recent months. So there's been so much bad polling about AI that's sort of dubiously sourced from, not high quality surveys that are put out by people with vested interests in making these claims who basically just want the PR that have led to, I think, a huge inflation in how familiar most people are with this. If you look at data from places like Pew that have done longitudinal work on this, that have fairly rigorous quality checks, I think it's very easy to get the impression, oh, literally every single person in the world is using ChatGPT. And the adoption has been incredibly rapid and incredibly notable. And I don't want to downplay that, but it's also not universal. And I think people sort of who are very much in the middle of things tend to overestimate how much people know or interacting with something that's new. Because even with something that's been as revolutionary as the sort of very quick adoption of large language models has been, it's still not something that's uniformly spreading across society. So I think the first thing is looking at meeting people where they are. How much do people know about this? If you look at questions back, I love the Roper Center. I'm going to give a shout out to them. They have incredible historical data, which is always so fun to look at. And if you look at questions from these sort of early ages of the internet, it is so great because they have to define all of these things. Like, this is what the internet is. How often do you use it? And you can see that sort of falling away as people get more comfortable with it as it becomes more universal. So I think it is just sort of, you start off with a lot of explanation, a lot of sort of hand holding, a lot of this is what we mean by that. And that can sort of fall away. But it is always fascinating because you don't know 15 years later what you're going to wish you asked or what trend question that you started asking that you're going to be locked into and regret for the next 40 years. But, I do think it's really always interesting to sort of see that sort of dawn of a topic and where you don't have all of this data and all of these sort of shorthand forms.
Yeah, I saw one the other day that I think was I think it was for Microsoft, and they had done a very specific study about how Latina women of childbearing age were using AI, and there was just a lot of odd stuff in there. Like, and they. I have had a history of working with Microsoft. There is a tendency, not just by them, but by lots of companies, to kind of have a internal catchphrase that they're using to talk about a particular product or technology with a particular demographic of potential customers, and they will throw it in to see if people agree with their internal catchphrase, and some percentage of people will go, sure, why not? But but they had something that was like, I don't know, like they wanted to like make the AI like a surrogate abuela in the family, and I was like, no, no, I don't believe anyone actually thinks that.
That is sure a phrase.
And there was another one that was circulating with AI that was indicating that lots of people were, using it for like almost like therapeutic, supportive, life planning, coaching themselves kind of uses. And I was like, who is the sponsor of this one? Because this feels very pointed also in a very particular direction. And obviously when I talked to Molly White about crypto polling, you have similar things where like Brian Armstrong is funding lots of survey research into how people are using crypto. The sampling is not great and the study design is also not great. And so you have to then compare to, like, to your point again, Pew has done some good longitudinal questioning about people's adoption of crypto. And like, it'd be one thing if they were in the same ballpark. They're really not.
Yeah.
And so like, it kind of becomes a question of whose survey gets in front of which policymakers first, I suppose. But that sort of question of like going back to some of those early, and yes, the Roper Center is amazing for having those archives, those like early questions about, have you heard of the internet? Is like an important question. When you present that data, do you ever sort of do cuts by like people who say they are very familiar with something versus people who say they haven't heard much about it?
We try to do that, and we have some of that in our latest survey that hopefully we'll have a little bit more on. I think one of the challenges when you're looking at those attention cuts is that often it ends up sort of being confounded in a whole lot of ways because there are usually tremendous demographic and partisan differences in levels of attention. And so all of that gets very mixed together. And it's very difficult to say, oh, it's because of the level of attention rather than it's because young people or older people, depending on the topic, are paying way more attention than any other group, or because there's this huge partisan divide in sort of who's tuning in. So I think it's really useful, but I think it's also something that has to be treated very carefully because it is always this question of, okay, so where is that actually coming from?
Right. So that actually leads to another question I sort of perennially have about the sort of use of demographic crosstabs and attentional or awareness-based crosstabs as well is, um, how frequently do you do kind of cluster analysis, looking for the characteristics of the people who say that they know the most and then also have the most positive attitudes about topic X? I mean, do you ever kind of try to figure out what are the profiles of the people who have positive, connotations around something, but low awareness versus high awareness? I mean, is that something you try to take a look at and get a sense of
It's something I would
how
love.
information filters?
It's something I'd love to do more of. I would say frequently it's not something that we sort of delve into as much, A, just because of the sort of time constraints, and B, because of the sample size constraints. So a lot of times we are sort of looking at the sort of major crosstabs. And then, one thing that I always do try to look at is, because partisanship is so powerful as a dividing line, and because it's so easy to sort of often go for the here's the partisan divide story, is I always find it fascinating to look in party at divides.
Mm,
Okay, so you have Democrats, but how are younger and older Democrats different in this? How are male and female Republicans different in this? And a lot of times you start seeing really interesting sort of little nuances in how people within a party are divided. So
yeah.
that's somewhere that we look. We don't tend to do sort of like a huge like typology off of things quite as much
Right.
as I would like to, but it, it's something I'm always interested to see.
Yeah. It is an irony as a primarily my background and expertise is in qualitative research. I love me a segmentation study. There is nothing better than getting those cluster analyses to me, but that's because the clusters start to look like people I've met and the crosstabs don't look like anything to me,
Yeah.
as in terms of like they look like something to me. They're important, but they don't look like the people I met interviewing or focus groups or those sorts of things. It's also an interesting thing you point out about the kind of before partisan sort of positions have been hardened or set, that there is I know people love to use the concrete metaphor of like when it's still wet and things can be formed. There's this like the thing that comes to mind actually is the sort of partisan valence of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that kind of initially there was like broad agreement that was bad, team Ukraine, and then over time some of those opinions started to reshuffle a little bit as it took on a partisan valence. And it seems like there are a lot of things that sort of work that way. Do you have a sense of like how quickly those things move now, given the high levels of partisanship and kind of letting party identity sort of drive your position on topics maybe you're less aware of or less committed to in your own personal life?
I think it moves very, very quickly. And conveniently, right before I hopped on this call, I was actually listening to a panel on expressive responding, which is, partisan responding specifically, which is basically people answering survey questions where their answer is less about what they actually think or what they actually think is true and more about sort of cheerleading for their political side. And so one of the presentations that I saw was this survey experiment that it was Brian Schaffner and Sam Looks at the YouGov. And so this was during the first Trump inauguration when Sean Spicer claimed that the inauguration was more broadly attended than Obama's, despite the fact that this was blatantly untrue. And they showed pictures of the two inaugurations and asked people which one they thought was more highly attended. And, a very minority, but a higher minority of Trump voters, I think it was like 15%, said that they thought the clearly emptier inauguration was the
Mm-hmm.
better attended one, which was basically just saying, no, we were standing with our guy. And so I do think a lot of people are sort of things move quickly, people jump on it. The thing I always worry about a little bit is that if you think about what connects the kinds of people who have those reactions, who are very partisan, who understand these cues and sort of hop on them, is they also tend to be highly engaged, which means that they're also the type of people who tend to respond to surveys. And,
Mm-hmm.
especially if you're looking at, web panelists who are sort of taking these surveys, but also people who answer phone calls. And basically, I think this sort of circles around a sort of larger, issue that's of perennial concern in surveys right now, which is that are we overstating the sort of prevalence of the people who do have this sort of instinctive reaction to surveys? So I do think it's real, but I also think we probably are predisposed to find a bunch of them.
To find that group of people that are going to engage in that expressive responding. I mean, I talked a little bit with Brian about that phenomenon of this expressive responding. Are you? I kind of remember when it sort of first started being something that got talked about in more popular discourse. I think it was around the 2016 election where there was a lot of concern around, obviously there was concern about the shy Trump voter. There was concern about people responding in certain kinds of ways to pollsters in order to own the libs or something. But it also seemed like some of the evidence around expressive responding at the time was still sort of interesting, indicative, but not conclusive that that's what was going on. As that sort of area of study, progressed? Do we have more of a sense of who engages in expressive responding and how much of it is as you say, a function of sample versus actually how people respond to these questions?
And I mean, I think people have, studied this much more in depth than I have. What I will say is that I think the real difficulty is that I think there's an underlying force that both leads self-expressive responding, but I think people also genuinely may think more along partisan lines than they used to when you ask them questions about the economy, the sort of direction of the country. People conceptualize that in very political terms, and that could be a genuine response. It's not that they're just saying that, it's how they're actually thinking, and those are very difficult to disentangle. I mean, I do think some of the work that I've seen suggests that there is a variation in how much people are driven by pure expressive responding, which is, basically saying this even though I don't actually think this because it's sort of for my side. Like when I was doing some economic polling in the Biden era, I think on one sense, I think people probably genuinely have different beliefs about the economy depending on whether they're person is in power. We also have seen questions where we ask things like, are you having trouble? Are you changing your behavior to avoid economic problems like, not driving as much or not going on vacation, where there were, or shopping in different places, where there were these fairly large partisan gaps that I don't think could be solely explained by people actually reporting their behavior, and that I bet would have changed directions since the last time we asked them. So I think it's part of the explanation. I don't think it's the entire explanation, and I think it's a little impossible to know exactly how much of the explanation it is, which is a slightly unsatisfying answer.
Yeah, I mean, it does sort of point to, a thing that we sometimes do, for instance, in just sort of trying to figure out, I don't know that surveys are the greatest way to figure out share of wallet, for example, in a particular consumer category. But one of the things that we do is ask questions that are stated responses, and then we have other questions that serve as derived responses to things. So we might ask a question of, if you can guess how much you've spent on sneakers in the last 6 months, enter in a number here. And then we might subsequently ask a question of how many pairs of sneakers have you bought? Which brands of sneakers have you bought? Which particular, in the case of, high-end sneakers, which particular models or whatever of sneakers have you bought? And then we can go do the math on what those retail for, right? And so somewhere between those numbers is probably reality, most likely.
That's fascinating. I know one study that I remember reading about that I have not read in detail, so I apologize if I screw up the details here, but it was basically asking people about what news sources they consumed, and then having, a study where they actually monitored people's news consumption on a really granular level. Like, I don't know if it was a web tracker or what it was, but they did find that there was partisan sort of overrepresentation of people saying, well, this news source that congenial to me, that sort of aligns with my views, they were sort of likely to overreport listening to that, when in actuality it wasn't quite as segmented as they were going to say if you sort of just said, oh, hey, what do you pay attention to?
That's super interesting. I feel like we've done a lot of stuff looking at audience research for news outfits in the past, not about specifically politics, but about general interest, and then also a lot of stuff around business. But it's a particularly interesting thing also to have folks, we'll ask them about, which of these newspapers or news sources do you use? They'll tell us, and then we'll have them do a diary study where they, screen cap their kind of routine and what they look at. And one of the things that stood out to me in a study that we did in 2018, I think, was people would talk about subscribing to a variety of newspapers, and then we'd watch their diaries over the course of 5 days. And really what they meant was they followed them on Facebook.
Oh, wow.
And so they were getting headlines in the feed, not always clicking through and reading the whole story, but like getting that head, subhead, and then moving on. But following the New York Times, the Washington Post, or whatever, to them felt like subscribing, which was fascinating. Just as like we're not all talking in the same language about our behavior either. And I wonder about that with some questions like, I remember this from, probably back in like December 2023 or so. There were a lot of polling questions around, like lists, batteries of things that were really important to you in the upcoming election, and like democracy being one of them. And depending on the poll, you'd get it into the top 5 or into the top 7 or something like that. And yet I knew that the way you're thinking about it when you respond to that question probably has a partisan valence, and what you think is going on with democracy may not be all the same thing. Like one person might be concerned about curtailment of access to ballot boxes, and somebody else might be concerned about thinking that there are people who are not citizens who are voting in federal elections, or, we're all thinking about different things when we answer that question. And I wonder about that too with things like, one of the things I was fascinated by with this poll that you just did with SSRS of like, government should do more. The parties are very different. I don't really agree with them about most things. Like there's some really interesting, like there's a lot of play in the joints there that if I were either of those parties, I would really be trying to figure out. They think we're really different. They don't like either of us very much, or they don't agree with us very much on the policy positions we've taken, and they wish we were doing more. So what are we doing too much of? What are we doing too little of? Like figuring all of that out, I imagine as a strategic question for the campaigns or the parties would be very challenging. But I'm curious about how you read that, how you think about what are the mental models, I guess, that people are bringing to some of these questions about do more, do less. They're very different. They're very similar, and how that's shifted over time. Because these charts are great. I love a chart where lines start crossing because something has happened. And
yes, absolutely.
And so maybe tell us a little bit about the study you just conducted.
Yeah, and I think the qualitative work is so important with things like this because, like you said, when you start talking to people, when you start sort of breaking it down, it is so different. And one of the open-ended questions that we did during the cycle last time that I really loved was we asked the question, what do you think is the biggest difference between the candidates? Not, what is the most important issue? What is the biggest difference between the candidates, the most important difference? And this was when it was still looking like a Biden-Trump race. But what we found is that a lot of times it wasn't necessarily an issue. Like sometimes it was, I don't agree with this person on this plan. Sometimes it was character. We did this with the parties too. A lot of times it was a sense, do they care or not? Which is something that I think is very hard to measure, sort of a separate question, but that's sort of what it came down to is, do they care about me? Do they align with my beliefs more than, well, it's this issue. And that's, when you see people say my most important issue was X, I think that's interesting and can be really important, but it gets so flattened because just because you think X is important doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to vote on the basis of X because I see the candidates as different. One example that I really love was education. Education sort of became a flashpoint, top issue. Everyone says it's very important. At one point we asked, okay, so you said education is really important. What do you mean by that? And very few people meant the sort of political flashpoint version of education that was coming up a lot in this was like 2021, 2022. What people meant was education is important to me because I want good schools and because I care about the future of our country and we need to make sure that people are learning. Mm. Democracy, as you said, is a huge thing where there's just always this difference. And so when we ask these sort of broad questions, I think the trend is really valuable because it does show people are thinking about this differently than they used to, but it doesn't necessarily mean people are thinking about this in the same way. And like, as you said, it's incredibly complicated when you see, I think there really is this sort of sense that partisanship is sharper. I think you don't have to pay that much attention to politics to see that it's very sordid in a lot of ways. And, the people tend to live near people who think like them, that the parties have become very sort of sharply divided along a lot of issues. On the other hand, as you see from the last election, there's obviously not static. There's this demographic change in how aligned people feel with a particular party that's not going to just remain the same and static forever. And I think you can see also that it shows, I think, how people really flatten the idea of happiness with the party, because people tend to think either, well, if they're not happy with the party, they want a third party, they're not going to vote for these guys, or just because they're voting with this party, they agree with everything they do. And it's a lot more complicated than that. People are making this decision between who's on the ballot. And at the same time, you see, I think right now, a lot of Democrats who are very disillusioned with the Democratic Party. They oppose Donald Trump more than they oppose anyone in the Democratic Party, and they're still probably going to turn out to vote against his candidates in the midterms, you would think.
Right.
But they still also have this really fundamental unhappiness with the turn that things have taken and the way that their party is responding. And I think there's a lot of complexity to unpick there.
Yeah. I mean, what drove some of the questions that you asked in this, or that you were working with SSRS asked in this fairly recent poll that you did about sort of trust in either party to do what voters actually want them to do? I mean, I think that is particularly interesting in this moment, because I think, coming up to relatively recently, this story really was about Democratic voters being disillusioned with the Democratic Party, but, Republican voters being pretty cool with their choice, or at least less dissatisfied by quite a bit. Makes sense. They won the election, so they should feel pretty satisfied for a while. But it looks like there are some things where actually people feel like, they would like government to be more effective. They don't really think either party's going to do it, though. What prompted you to ask some of these questions? I'm just curious about that.
So there are two different parts of that. One was that we really wanted to sort of check in on issues and just sort of take the temperature of America and a lot of these things that we've had trend going back for a really long time. And we are entering this new second Trump era, and I wanted to see what people actually thought about these things over time, and sort of step back from how Donald Trump specifically is doing all these issues and say, what do people want? What are the sort of American values, and how has that sort of shifted? And just sort of across a range of sort of really big picture. Obviously, it's not every single issue, but things that we'd asked before, and checking back in to sort of see how that had moved. With the parties, the idea of issue ownership we thought was really sort of interesting, which is just sort of who has the lead on this and how has this shifted over time. There are issues that are very traditionally Republican over the past couple of cycles: the economy, immigration. There are issues that are very typically Democratic: abortion, climate change, issues to do with race and to do with gender and to do with, sexuality and that sort of spectrum. And I think on a lot of sides, the narratives have been that this has all changed. And I don't know necessarily that our polling always found that. We see that Donald Trump is now underwater on the economy, and basically all polling, the Republican Party is not quite as dominant a lead as they've had, but they are still trusted more than Democrats. When you come to issues like handling race, like handling issues relating to LGBT people in society and how that's handled, Democrats still have the edge, which is sort of a little bit at odds with the idea that these are sort of the fundamental weaknesses of the party. And then obviously there's a salience component here. What should people be talking about? But checking in was really interesting. And I will also say, we talked earlier about a don't know. This is also a thing where a lot of the times when we'd ask these questions in decades past, or when other people had asked this in years past, it was by phone. And so we'd say, is it this party or this party? And some people would say neither. Now that most of our surveys, we do multi-mode, but it's largely web. And so it's a choice. Do you want to have an explicit neither option or not? And so we have that in because I think very clearly represents a real opinion that a lot of people hold.
Right.
And so I think that's always sort of interesting is I bet it would look different if you didn't have that neither option. People would probably say, okay, well, I'll pick a party and you might get some interesting answers, but it would also miss this really strong discontent among a lot of people who don't see themselves represented by other party, who belong to a party but sort of feel iffy on a couple of issues. And I think that's often really fascinating is where are people not defaulting to that partisan position?
Yeah. What else are you, I mean, we're not, I mean, unless you live in New Jersey or Virginia, we're not in a major election year. What other things are you interested in doing some polling and research around in an off year?
I actually like off years because I am probably not supposed to admit this. Elections are obviously so important and so consequential. From a polling perspective, I find that sometimes the least interesting part is just like how people are going to vote because I think it's so much more interesting how people think about politics. And it's just, there's so much more of a broad spectrum. And there are also people who are not necessarily voters. And I think it's really interesting in polling to look at people who aren't necessarily turning out and to look at people through a lens that's not just reduced to that one choice they make. Because obviously, when you have a limited number of candidates, the way that people get to those choices that they make can vary so much. And so, what I'm always sort of fascinated in doing is sort of saying, we're living in a very consequential time. What does it mean to be an American right now? What do people's lives feel like? How are their lives changing? What's important to them? And, that's very broad. You can also narrow that down to very specific questions. What are your hopes and dreams for the country, for your family, for how do you see the world? What do you think is changing? And I just think there's such a spectrum of really interesting research to be done in terms of how people are viewing this political moment.
I want to I want to ask you a hypothetical question so badly.
Okay.
Um, if if I could like wave a magic wand and just sort of delete from everyone's collective memory the desire to have rolling predictions of presidential election outcomes, what would you do differently in an election year? Would you do what you're doing now in an off year, just try to understand how people are feeling about things? Would you be more interested in people who are less likely to vote? What would be different if you didn't have to service the prediction part of the polling world?
It's a good question, and I will say that I for having said that, I do think that horse race questions are important and do have a role to play because I think in the absence of that, people are still going to talk about it, and I think having some evidence to base it on makes it better. Because if you think about how people would be talking about an election in the complete absence of knowing whether it looks like it's going to be close or not, I think you could see a lot of ways in which that's less than ideal. But
Mm-hmm.
magic wand, nobody cares, nobody's clicking, nobody wants to see who's up or down. I mean, in one of my past roles, we basically did no horse race polling. And I think that what you still end up sort of getting a lot of questions that are tangential to that and that are about how people talk about politics. I think that's still valuable. I think the sort of other question is how people see themselves in the political space. Like, are you
Mm.
someone who's following politics? Are you someone who's being contacted by a campaign? Are you somebody who is just ignoring this and hoping it will go away until November, but you're still going to cast a ballot? And then I just also think there's a lot of polling to be done that is not strictly political. During COVID, especially, I did a lot of work that was just about how people are living their lives. What do you miss most from the sort of pre-pandemic era? What would you change about your living situation if you could? And I think, and that was sort of fascinating to me because everybody was going through this sort of very similar experience, but they were going through it separately and in a lot of different ways. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think horse race polling can be important. I think political polling is extremely important. And I also think there's just a lot to know about how people live their lives that isn't necessarily, doesn't need to be reduced to, and what does that mean for the election? And I guess that
Right.
to circle back, I think that's the thing that I would change is that I think polling often gets reduced to what does this change in public opinion mean for strategy or mean for how people can vote. And I think what people think about politics is important and impactful and meaningful and worth measuring, regardless of whether that's something that's going to change their vote.
Yeah. I mean, part of what you're saying makes me think about there was a little bit of back and forth amongst some political scientists in my feed of maybe a month ago about kind of lacking a theory of attention around news and politics that like I mean, I'll tell you that like it's constantly being theorized in the universe of advertising on the commercial side, like what breaks through, what gets attention, how do we get in front of people? I mean, that's the whole ball game really in advertising. But I am curious about, are you trying things out to figure out like, because I personally think it's very interesting to talk to people who are very infrequent or just not at all voters, because it's not like they're not participating in politics. They're having conversations with their friends and neighbors and family members. They may even be influencers of people who do vote. Obviously, the outcomes of elections will affect their lives, so they have to live with the consequences of other people's behavior. But I'm curious about how you think about trying to get underneath what people are paying attention to, what's getting through to them. I know that, that CNN has had that breakthrough project for a while, but I'm curious how I know that's not your specific project, but I'm curious about how you think about figuring out what's getting through to people, how they structure their attention around politics. I mean, there's so many kind of conventional wisdom things about, we can layer on the only weird people take polls, but like the kind of people don't pay attention until August or, whatever, those kinds of shorthands for understanding people's engagement with politics and news. I'm curious about how you're thinking about trying to understand that, or is that something that you're interested in?
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating question. And the breakthrough project you mentioned, which I did not start, but I was thrilled to get to be a part of. So we did that.
Super jealous, by the way. I would have loved to sit on those conversations.
So we, along with some our survey partners and our academic partners, worked on this project that was basically asking people, what have you heard about each of the candidates in the last week in your own words? And looking through the responses to that is so fascinating, because you get some things that are written basically like by somebody who you can tell is, refreshing Twitter or Blue Sky and watching the news and reading the paper. And it's basically a front page. They said, well, I saw this story happen. This happened. I saw this happened. There are some people who are saying, oh, I saw these memes about this. There are some people who say, there are people who are talking about something that happened like a month ago. Trump got shot or Kamala Harris got the nomination, and it was a month later, but that was still sort of the thing that had stuck in their minds. And you really just saw that people follow these things different ways. And, a few years before that, I did an experiment. This was during the first Trump administration, where it was one of those insane weeks where several people, I think, had gotten indicted. It was very busy. Everybody in the news industry's hair was on fire. I did a question. I said, tell me in your own words what happened in the news in the last week. And again, we saw these incredible variation in responses from that. Some people were just like on top of everything. They wanted to name names. Some people were very much in their reaction. It was less about the facts about what happened and more about, well, we sure showed them, didn't we? Or
Right.
They were completely railroaded. It was how they reacted. And then I saw there's someone who said, well, I saw that a lost cat escaped locally. People who were looking at their sort of local news stories.
Yeah.
And I thought this was sort of fascinating, is there were a lot of people who just apologized for not paying closer attention or were sort of very defensive about it. And again, this was a web survey, completely anonymous, but there's someone saying, well, I was, working at the food bank and I have kids and I had to go to appointments, so I haven't really had that much time to check in. So I was like, I was camping, we didn't have an internet connection. Yeah. And people have lives. People have other things that they're doing. It doesn't mean that they're not paying attention to politics. It doesn't mean they're not talking about it. But, there are people for whom this is something that we are paying attention to as part of our work every day. And there are people for whom this is sort of not the main focus. And it's something that sort of filters in through a lot of other priorities that are sort of busy and full lives. And I think trying to figure out what actually makes it through is fascinating and really difficult.
That's great. I mean, I think it's such worthwhile stuff, and we will also link to the Breakthrough Project reports, because that became my obsession, because I was like, for my own mental health, I could not do the horse race stuff, but I was fascinated by like what was getting across to people, and I think sometimes you see things that people respond to a particular survey, and my reaction to it is like, I don't know what the heck they're talking about, but that broke through. Whatever that rumor or meme or whatever was, that got through to some group of people, completely missed it. And so I just love that work. What are some things that people should be looking out for coming up? That if you can talk about them, if you can't talk about them, how do people kind of connect with the work that you do?
Well, we will always have our polling. We have a new polling sort of sub-site set up on CNN where we're always going to have our latest, which is both the numbers that we're releasing, some analysis that we're doing. And so I hope folks will follow that. I post too much on Blue Sky at the moment. So, but, I think we're going to be doing a lot of sort of interesting work, just sort of looking at where people are. And as we do head into the midterm, sort of what political opinion looks like right now and how that's going to look like in an election where Trump is not going to be on the ballot, but is obviously going to be very much top of mind.
Yeah. Well, Ariel, thank you so much for taking the time with me. I know you have other important things to be doing, so I'm really appreciative.
Thank you so much. This was a delight.
Crosstabs is a production of The Difference Engine. It is edited and hosted by me, Farrah Bostic. Music is from Audio Jungle by S Audio. You can subscribe to our weekly newsletter for free at crosstabspodcast.com. You can also follow the show on Blue Sky at crosstabspod.bluesky.social and on LinkedIn, where we share links to new episodes and newsletters. We also share these episodes via video, and you can like and subscribe to each week's video episode on YouTube at Crosstabs Podcast. Please follow us on your favorite platform, tell your friends about the show, and don't forget to subscribe on whatever your favorite podcast service happens to be. If you want to learn more about what I do, you can find me on all the socials at Farrah Bostic, though I am mostly on Blue Sky these days, or get in touch through thedifferenceengine.co. And that's it. See you next time.